everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. On this episode, Kyle and I talked to Dr. Chris Bache, who is a very interesting character. He went through, over the course of a number of years, 73 high-dose LSD sessions and had some very interesting things to report back, and personal growth and much more. We get into it in the episode in quite a bit of detail. And the name of the book is LSD and the Mind of the Universe. We are giving away 3 copies, and you can find that in the show notes. We'll have a link to the contest there, and also in our social media. You can find a link to our contests and giveaways. Typically, you can also find it just at psychedelicstoday.com/welcome. And it was a really mind-blowing episode for me. We don't really need to spoil anything, but Dr. Chris Bache has some extraordinary things to share. And as a recently retired university professor, comes with quite a bit of perspective and education on topics that I think we should all be aware of if we're going to get into the transpersonal. So I think that's it for right now. So enjoy this episode. This show is brought to you by Onnit, ONNIT.com. Use the code PSY today at checkout for 10% off everything but fitness equipment. I've tried a bunch of their products. I really do like their Alpha Brain product, which is kind of like a nootropic, like a cognitive enhancer, and it's gotten me out of some really tough situations that I've been in the past, business meetings and whatnot. It's just really helpful. And if you're working on a problem, cognitively difficult problem, Alpha Brain might be there to help you, along with some coffee. We've also got some good stuff like New Mood, helps balance your neurotransmitters a bit, supplements where you might be missing some things in your nutrition, and a lot of people just love it. I've used it a bunch. I've actually used it as a supplement to help me come back from a long party weekend, and it's been great. I've also got some melatonin spray on there, so if you're having trouble sleeping, melatonin can really help. They've also got all sorts of like fish oil and supplements that you can check out, nutrition as well, like coffee and various drinks, shirts, and other merch. So again, Onnit, ONNIT.com / actually, that's just it, Onnit.com, and the code PSY today for 10% off your order. We are also brought to you by Audible, audibletrial.com /psychedelics today, or again, psychedelicstoday.com /welcome. And you can find your Audible free trial link, 30-day free trial, and a free audiobook if you sign up using our link. And it helps us quite a bit. There's some great books up there, from Tim Leary books to Terrence McKenna and more. Even the recent Mike J book on mescaline is up there, and it is extraordinary. So check that out and let us know what you think. I think if you're into podcasts, you will also like audiobooks. So check it out. You owe it to your brain to give it some books once in a while. Books are where people can really flesh out an idea in full, and it's good for your cognitive diet. Also, we have a course coming up called Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. This course is designed to help you understand this coming landscape of psychedelic drugs to clinical practice. There is a huge variety of interventions coming up for different, indications, and it's going to be a really big deal in medicine. I would say it's already a big deal in medicine. So if you want to understand microdosing, macrodosing, psychedelic therapy at, the basic level, this is only an 8-week course. We can't teach you everything. More than, it'd probably take 5 years to really, really get you to black belt grade. But this is where you should start if you're a clinician or therapist. We've moved it from a 5-week to an 8-week course because 5 weeks just really wasn't enough. We've got some really great master classes there from different experts in the field, names like Dr. Catherine McLean, Ashley Booth from the Aware Project, Mitch Gomez from Dance Safe, Shannon Claire Carlin, who helps run the MDMA therapy training program at MAPS, Ingmar Gorman, Jessica Katzman, PsyT, who does ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. We've got all sorts of great stuff up here. Raquel Bennett, who runs the Kriya Institute and the Kriya Conference, really big into ketamine as well, and more. So check it out, psychedelicstoday.com or psychedeliceducationcenter.com. You can learn more about our Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. Classes start in February. We have course times that are friendly for a European audience and a North American audience too. So right around 7 p.m. Eastern and 7 p.m. London time, I believe. But the time specifics are on the website. So I hope you join us, or at least come to our website to learn more, or tell your friends. We would really like some referrals, and there's some great testimonials up on the page too if you want to check it out. And of course, also comes with I think a 30-day money-back guarantee. I'll probably put that up on the website soon. But yeah, so no real risk if you jump in. It's okay if you find out it's not for you. But if you're a clinician with an interest in this field, we think this is for you. Also, if you like our show and you have friends that might be interested in this topic, probably the most flattering thing you can do to us. If you want to see me blush, tell your friends about Psychedelics Today. Maybe send them a link to a couple episodes or invite them to the Facebook group. We're up to about 3,000 people on there now. And that would be amazing. And if you want to support us with a small monthly donation, you can do that too. Patreon.com/psychedelics today. Donations as small as $2 a month help quite a bit. So thank you all for tuning in to Psychedelics Today. I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. Chris Bache, and we'll see you on the other side. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Chris Bache, retired professor and professor emeritus at Youngstown State University and author of the recent book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. We're also going to be doing a giveaway, so stay tuned on that. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here, guys.
So I had been talking about you, I think even a couple years ago when I found out about your kind of long-term project before probably the book was even with a publisher. And I was really excited by the idea, and then I just totally forgot. And then all of a sudden we got connected, I think through the publisher. And now I'm very excited to record with you because this is quite the project you've undertaken. And you've got some very unique insights to share. How do you like to start this story? Like, maybe we can start with psychedelics. How did psychedelics come on your radar initially?
Well, I had just finished graduate school. I was publishing a few articles out of my dissertation. I was looking for where to take my research. I was a brand spanking new university professor, and I met the work of Stan Grof. And that's what really snapped my head to attention. I did not have a psychedelic history. I finished graduate school in religious studies as a pretty deeply convinced, atheistically inclined agnostic. But I read Stan's work and the light bulb went off inside of me. And I said, this is important, not just to psychology, but it's important to philosophy of religion, which was my training. And I wanted to get involved. I wanted to do it. But of course, it had been made illegal. So I split my life. In my ordinary day job, I continued to function as a professor of religious studies in the department, taught conventional kind of courses or semi-conventional courses. And I began what became eventually a 20-year journey working with LSD, following Stan Grof's paradigm, and then pushing the limits of that paradigm pretty far, much farther than I appreciated at the time. And I was trained in philosophy of religion, and so I kept careful records, careful notes, tried to make the engagement as clean and as productive as possible. And I knew there would come a time, sooner or later, when I would share the experiences or share the insights from the experiences with a broader audience. And after I retired from the university, that time finally came.
Perfect. And what was the first... Did you have any kind of previous spontaneous mystical experiences or anything before that kind of clued you into how important these things might be?
No, I've always been envious of people who have had, I was 12 years old when I had my first spontaneous mystical experience. That's not the way it's been for me. I've always been kind of deeply locked into my body and my physical experience. I was reasonably well educated in Western religious thought. I became educated in Eastern religious thought, in a broad spectrum of contemporary thought. But no, I had no background in many ways. I'm the last person you would have expected to write a book on deep psychedelic states of consciousness. I grew up in Mississippi. I got a degree in theology from the University of Notre Dame before going on to graduate school. So it wasn't part of my background at all.
I'm curious, how did you stumble across Stan's work by not having any exposure to psychedelics beforehand?
Well, I was reading widely in different areas. I was reading in kind of emerging transpersonal psychology. It interested me. The two people whose work I met my first year out, one was Ian Stevenson, whose work at the University of Virginia convinced me that reincarnation is a simple fact of life. And that was a jolt, because it hadn't been part of my education anywhere. And then I met Stan's work, and he had just published 2 years before Realms of the Human Unconscious, and that was a book that really did it for me. And so Ian gave me kind of empirical evidence that there had to be another dimension of reality other than the physical world, because if there is any time interval between the death of one personality and the birth of the second personality, there has to be a place for them to exist during that time. And Stan gave me the methodology that allowed me to the prospect of exploring that reality. So I just decided to go for it.
It's awesome.
So maybe next, what did the protocol look like to you? To me, it looks like a very clearly looks like the work being done at Hopkins and by MAPS now. But was it any different in your perspective at this point?
No, I think it's pretty much conventional in that respect. You're always working in complete isolation. You're always working with the sitter. You're always working with a very carefully curated playlist of music. The difference is, after I did 3 medium dose LSD sessions and then shifted to working with very high levels of LSD. So I worked at 500 to 600 micrograms. At first, I did it simply for efficiency, because it was hard to get time in a dual career marriage for, arranging a session day. And I wanted to make the most out of every day. I also thought it would get me to my early goal of enlightenment faster if I could kind of chew through my karma in bigger bites. That eventually is a project that just dissolved along the way. And the whole concept of a personal spiritual journey or strictly personal evolutionary project, that fell out along the way. So the difference, I think, is the quantity of the power. First, the psychedelic used, very different than psilocybin or MDMA, working with very high doses, which changed the whole trajectory of the experience. And then I basically began to curate a much more aggressive playlist with the music. I used a lot more indigenous music. I didn't use classical Western music. I used a much more aggressive approach to the music itself. But otherwise, very much like contemporary therapeutic approaches to psychedelics.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. I guess backtrack a little bit too. So your book really kind of covers these, 73 high dose sessions. So your book is covering all these insights of your experiences and some of your philosophical work and really understanding consciousness from these experiences. So I don't know I forget if we gave that little intro there. So that's just to give some context of what we're talking about and what Joe meant about protocol, of how you're setting that up. And I'm curious, why did the music change over time?
I happened upon some indigenous chanting music, and I threw it into my session on the next day or the next week. And it had such a profound impact on the intensity of the session. It basically rattled my cage much more aggressively than some of the more even aggressive classical music. I like the effect. I recognize that it's sort of more disorienting, more giving me stronger support for going deeper into consciousness. So I began to cultivate and collect that type of music.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And from your perspective, how important is music when you're doing high dose psychedelics or just psychedelic kind of therapy in that self-discovery format?
I think it's very important. Now, I've done sessions without music eventually after long down the road, and I've done psilocybin sessions with and without music. But in working with a very strong psychedelic like LSD and working at these very high doses, which, by the way, I don't recommend. I truly do not recommend that people do what I did. I wouldn't do it the same way if I did it today. But basically, when you're working with opening consciousness that radically, music has a tremendously powerful effect. I would maybe estimate it has a concentrating, amplifying effect by 5 or 10 times doing it without psychedelic, but without music. So I remember I started using music only in the 4th session, and the jump that happened in that 4th session was just enormous. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, it's a topic that keeps coming up, I guess, within the psychedelic community, especially when talking about putting playlists together for therapy. And I just recently recorded an episode with a fellow who composes music and ended up taking his experiences and making music out of it. So, yeah, I think the music piece is just really interesting. It's a huge part of breath work as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and Helen Bonny, of course, her early work plotting the various stages of an LSD journey and the characteristics of music that support each of those stages as we go. Important work.
Yeah. So where did this idea come from of wanting to engage in these high dose sessions? Like, did you start off saying, I'm going to do, X amount of sessions and really dive in? Or did you go in saying, I'll have a few and then see where it goes? Or did you have this idea kind of mapped out of doing X amount of sessions, or had a goal with it at all?
No, I did not have any trajectory or any goal. I saw the range of experiences that Stan described in realms of the human unconscious. I saw, since I had a pretty good grounding in Western philosophical thought and theological thought, I had a good sense of the significance of these states of consciousness that he was describing. And I believe that the people who would be making the most important contributions in my discipline would be speaking out of an experiential basis in a matter of years, not out of simply a theoretical basis, as was common in my time. So I knew that to do that, you just had to get in and do your work. And I had no idea how long the work would be. I was still thinking in the early years that, you basically go through ego death and then you get unrestricted access, to the deep consciousness of existence. What I found, of course, is that it's not a matter of simply of shattering the ego and going through ego death. The universe has many, many layers, and while it's all holographically integrated, in a sense, if you engage the universe systematically with a carefully defined kind of methodology, the universe takes you in by degrees, it takes you in by layers. And as you move into a new layer of consciousness and your consciousness stabilizes at that new layer, sooner or later, if you keep pushing it, the method you're using has sufficient power to take you to the very edge of that new layer. You're going to go through yet another death and rebirth process that's different than ego death, that builds upon that process. And you go through a series of death and rebirth processes as you explore progressively deeper levels of consciousness. And at least that's how it happened for me. It may be different for other people and different substances, but how it happened to me is that there was a systematic progression entry into communion with the universe. And that's the way I laid out the book. I just basically took it in, started at the beginning, I tried to recognize the levels of consciousness that I went into, consolidated the story to make it as efficiently conveyed as possible. And then each chapter basically goes into another level of consciousness or another level of engagement with the universe.
How would you, I guess, define that layer of consciousness? Like what do you mean by that of getting to these next layers? You know, sometimes you hear in like the new age, like, oh, you ascend to 3D to 5D, and maybe that's how, some people are making sense of that. But how would you describe that moving through layers?
Well, I adopted the working vocabulary that Stan has developed in his books of between psychic level, subtle level, and causal level consciousness. He differentiates low and high psychic, low and high subtle, and low and high causal. And that's a vocabulary that works for me. Of course, the universe is so deep and has so many hundreds of levels that those are just approximations, and I don't have any vested interest in a particular model of the universe or model of how many levels of consciousness there are. When I was going through and writing the book and looking back retrospectively at where this journey went and how many core death and rebirth cycles there are many sub-cycles of death and rebirth, but 4 fundamental death and rebirth cycles, and therefore different levels of consciousness one moves into. I differentiated 5 levels. The first takes place at the personal mind, the level of personal mind, and that culminates in ego death, where you lose your egoic or time-space identity. The second took place for me at the collective mind. Its dynamics fundamentally at the early subtle levels of consciousness. It has to do with the species mind, dimensions of species existence. The third level is archetypal mind, where one is moving into the high subtle level, moving beyond simply the collective consciousness of the species, moving into different levels of archetypal reality. The fourth, for me, is causal mind, causal oneness, where you're moving into profound states of non-dual reality, causal reality. And then the fifth is I call Diamond Luminosity, a particularly deep, clear experience of ultra clear, particularly clear dimension of light. And there are many, many different degrees of light that one encounters. The closest I could find in the conventional spiritual literature to this was in the Buddhist concept of Dharmakaya, the clear light of absolute reality, the light that exists prior to the Big Bang.
Right. Stan even kind of talks about that with his first LSD experience, right?
Yeah, wow,
he was talking about the lab proceeding and
way out. Yeah.
Thinking about these levels of consciousness and thinking about this like kind of new psychedelic renaissance with psychedelic therapy, how important do you think it is for therapists to kind of understand these levels of consciousness when working with clients?
If you're going to be a psychedelic therapist, of course, because there are many different levels of consciousness, as a therapist, one works at different levels of consciousness. So I don't think a therapist has to have deep familiarity with all the levels to work at the early levels. But I think conventional wisdom, it's a good wisdom that if you're going to be working with clients going into deep, non-ordinary states of consciousness, you must be personally familiar with those states. Otherwise, how can you be the stabilizing factor in the room when someone is losing their mind and is terrified of losing everything they know to be real? If you haven't been there yourself, if you haven't learned to let go, how can you help someone else let go at those deep levels? So I think it's very important. And that poses a challenge, of course, in training psychedelic therapists, because we're in this great period now. But that's going to be changing. We're going to be moving into a different legal environment soon, I hope. The work that you guys are doing and other people are doing is really creating new possibilities. But I think, personal experience is really important in this area.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's been a hot kind of topic, I guess, that people have been exploring. Should therapists really understand these layers of consciousness and these experiences to be a guide?
Yeah, which is interesting. This whole idea of, yes, you can get this training, but you don't necessarily need a session. But then there's this whole vast realm of religious and philosophy, like this material that discusses all of these states in kind of a literature form, or we can go experiential with it too. And my problem lately is I really want a very strong argument for this, and I haven't really personally been able to come up with one.
A strong argument for the importance of personal experience here?
At least personal experience. But the point I think that you made, which is unique, is there's these very complex spiritual experiences you can have, transpersonal experiences you have, and that's not really discussed in the literature, as far as I can tell. In terms of at least the recent literature, like how do you talk to somebody about this? Yes, you became Buddha for a millennia, and now you're trying to, work at your day job again. What do you do? But any comments on that kind of thing?
Well, I think it's important for people to have a good, solid theoretical grounding. I mean, I think it's important to read deeply in transpersonal psychology and works like Stan Grof and the various people who have been guiding people or taking people into these domains and have compiled a large database, experiential database. But if you don't have personal experience of these realities, you're always working at a disadvantage, and you can have a verbal understanding of what it means to go through into certain territories. But if you haven't some personal exposure of this territory, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to draw inferences where an experienced journeyer would not draw those inferences. You're going to find correlations where there aren't correlations. You'll miss correlations where there are correlations. These are very, very complex experiences. I mean, my journey lasted from 79 to 99, right, covering a 20-year spread. I didn't publish this book for another 20 years. And partly that was because of the legal complications. I had to retire from the university before I did this. But partly it took me years during the sessions and years after the sessions to work out the complex overlapping phenomenology of these states of consciousness. And, if I think the word guide is maybe not the best word. I mean, that implies a role of active guidance, of active direction, which is not really the case for, I think, doing much of this work. But to be a sitter, to be able to hold the ground, to be able to help somebody go to the edge of everything they know to be real and true about themselves and about the world, and help them jump over the edge, to give them the support that they need to lose their mind, to really let go of everything they know to be real and true. I don't know how one could really do that without having firsthand experience of those domains. And so to that extent, I think the effectiveness of therapists or sitters will be limited to their own depth of experience. They can be very, very good and skillful at levels 1, 2, perhaps, but maybe not so much at levels 3, 4, or 5, or whatever. You get the sense of it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting to think about, even like practical stuff, like going to different people for different like sessions, maybe. I mean, obviously you have no idea what the hell is going to come up, right? But somebody focusing more on personal dynamics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's good right now. We're proceeding very slowly, very methodically. We're using gentler psychedelics. There's no federal protocol that's suggesting using LSD in the high levels that I used it. And I think that's good. That's important. It's important that we proceed methodologically, carefully. We have a window. We lost our window 40 years ago.
Yeah.
The window is back, and it's important that we move very judiciously as we expand that window. But sooner or later, we're going to find what we found in the early years of psychedelic work, and that is healing the personal unconscious is only the first step of a long journey into the universe, into the deeper dimensions of consciousness, which take us into the, I don't know, what do you call it? I think of it as the mind of the universe, the mind of the cosmos. I hesitate to call it the divine mind or the mind of God, because that language has very strong cultural overtones that I don't really want to import.
Mm-hmm.
But when one dissolves, when one completely dissolves at time-space level and just dissolves into increasingly comprehensive fields of experience that open realities to you that you've never even dreamed possible. And if you go back again and again in a methodical way, levels of consciousness that at first swallow you up whole, and it's very, very hard to stay consciously aware at these new levels. And that's why I think we often call them ineffable. But
right.
If you go back consistently over and over again, what happens is you acclimate. You learn how to stay conscious at levels of consciousness that previously you were not able to stay conscious in. And that's a pattern that repeats itself as you go deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
I find that to be really true. Are you familiar with this gentleman, Kalindi Ayi from Detroit?
I'm not.
He is a very strong proponent of these high level doses, and I struggle with his arguments around it, but yours, seems quite sensible. It's, how do we approach it?
And I'm not a proponent of high doses myself. I mean, I did this work. I came through it. See, in the early years, the early high dose work done at Spring Grove Hospital with terminally ill patients, well, it's limited to 3 sessions. Low dose psychedelic work, open-ended. High dose work was limited to 3 sessions. And I thought, going into it, well, if you could do it safely 3 times, you could do it safely more times. But what I found was that by doing it as systematically as I did and pushing that edge as hard as I did, it required issues arose, challenges arose, which had not been discussed in the early levels of the work. Opportunities for insights and understanding emerged, but also challenges navigating these increasingly intense levels and large levels of consciousness and what it does to your body and mind. And as you go into these realities and how it affects people around you.
Mm-hmm.
I found that my students never knew about my work. I mean, I kept my work completely isolated from anyone on campus. But I found at a certain point, my students began to be activated by my psychedelic work. There was a natural contagion that was happening because consciousness at these deeper levels is open-ended. It's like a lake. You throw a rock in the lake, the ripples spread out. So when one person goes very, very deep, people around them are naturally going to be impacted. And I had to learn how to take care of the activations that my students were experiencing. And I wrote the book, The Living Classroom, that came out of years and years of trying to understand this dynamic between my mind and their mind and our minds together in the context of, consciousness at large. So it's not just a matter of taking care of your own body and your own emotions and your intimate relationships. It's taking care of everyone who's touched by your work at a larger collective level. But I wouldn't push it as hard if I were doing it again. It's not that I would avoid working with high doses, but I would balance it working with lower doses. And I would balance working with LSD, which pushes a high cosmological ceiling, with psilocybin work and ayahuasca work, which is much more kind of embodied psychedelic states.
Yeah. Man, there's a couple questions I want to ask. I don't know which direction I want to go into, but I want to come back to this idea, the ripples, right? Because I've thought about this a lot, and I'm kind of curious what your take is on this, of having some of these experiences. And I've even had it in breathwork sessions where it's like tapping into, I guess how you describe it, like this lake, you kind of toss it in and there's like ripples in time wave or something like that, where all these kind of synchronistic things might start happening. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, you're talking about your students changing. Do you think that was more in the sense of your presence and the way that you were showing up? Or do you think it was kind of more in that subtle realm world where you're going into these states and it is having more of a ripple on some other sort of level?
I think it's a both and. I think it does, as my work changed me, Certainly, my presence in the classroom changed. But the more interesting aspect, I think, is working at the subtle level.
Right.
I began, for example, I found that when I was lecturing and just looking for a random example, looking for an example to illustrate some concept that I wanted to, was bringing forward. And I would pause, I would just stop, and my mind would go blank, and this idea would come to me to give this example, and I would use that example. And students began to come up to me after class and began to say very quietly when they were sure no one was listening, it's funny you use that example today because that's exactly what happened to me this week.
Mm.
And first I thought this was just, an interesting accident, but it kept happening and happened repeatedly. And not only was it happening frequently enough that I knew it had to have some significance, but the deeper I went in my own work, the more the students were being touched in very, very deep, private, personal areas of their lives, places where they needed healing, places where they were blocked, places where they needed some help getting through to the next stage of their own development. So as I was kind of facing my blocks and entering into deep communion with the intelligence of life, it was as if the very fabric, the intelligent fabric around me was being activated and triggering these kind of aha moments with my students and their own confrontations with their blocks. And the students knew that something unusual was happening. I couldn't exactly explain what it was, but I had to, we all knew something was happening. So I would have students taking my courses partly for the intellectual content, but partly because they wanted to be in the energy of the room. Mm. But I found it wasn't just that there was a resonance spontaneously occurring between my energy and their energy. There was a second phenomenon that I discuss in the living classroom, and that is the effect of group fields. Yeah. That is that just like morphogenetic fields, Rupert Sheldrake's concept of morphic fields, except these are smaller. These are not species-wide fields. These are more specific fields. I found that there were psychic fields growing around my courses that were getting stronger year by year the more students studied with me in these courses. And it was a field that was being generated by their learning. So hundreds and hundreds of students learning over many years creates a field that was impacting and accelerating and deepening the learning of subsequent students in subsequent semesters. So there were multiple factors going into this phenomenon.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. And I don't know how to make sense of it at times. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
But it turns out that once you let go of an atomistic psychology, and it's not that atomistic psychology is really true. That is, the psychology which treats our individual consciousness as the individual standalone phenomenon. We know that that's true. But underneath that is a quantum reality, it's a quantum psychology. And once you let go of this idea that everything that happens around us can be explained in terms of the aggregate of simply individual awareness and open to this larger participatory cosmos where there is a deeper context, it's like a deeper tide that's always moving in and out, it's always flowing. It actually becomes very coherent. It's very easy to understand. It's just that you have to shift your metaphysical basis.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
It's like plate tectonics. In the early years, it was very, very hard to see. It just looked ridiculous. But once we began to see it, then a whole lot of data began to make sense, and it was elegant and simple and transparent.
Yeah. I'm curious also to kind of go back to that idea of kind of incorporating mushrooms and ayahuasca. You kind of said that it seems to be a little bit more body medicine. Could you talk about the difference between your experiences with LSD and the more plant-based psychedelics? This is a question that we've been asked a lot, and I think we even chatted about it in our course last 2 nights ago, of like, what is the difference between like LSD? Is that a little bit different? That like I've always, like somebody said, I always heard it's like more psychological than say more kind of like biographical and doesn't have this like spirit, right? Where Albert Hoffman said, right? He said, psilocybin, there seems to be something in there, right? So yeah, I wonder what your take is.
Well, inevitably, my take is based on my own personal experience. And so it's always dangerous to generalize on an N of one. So I just don't want to overgeneralize. Yeah. Psychedelics, which have been used historically, have fields associated with them. So we've been using mushrooms for thousands and thousands of years. And I think there's a certain sense in which around the biochemistry of this substance, there are fields of human experience of human beings engaging the deeper dimensions of their own consciousness and consciousness at large using this substance. And when one takes this substance, you don't just introduce a chemical into your body, which then you have a private experience of this substance, but there is a sense in which how this substance affects you is mediated in part by the history of your species with this substance. And I think that's also true with ayahuasca, where there's a multi-thousand-year history surrounding ayahuasca. With LSD, we don't have those fields. Right. I mean, LSD is a new substance, and I don't think the difference is fundamentally organic versus synthetic. I don't find that discussion terribly illuminating. I mean, our experience in the 60s and 70s, that's a few decades. That's not a whole lot of experience when it comes to these types of fields that I'm talking about. So in my experience, that living quality, that kind of living intelligence quality, I'm sure that there are spiritual agencies on the other side which may account for part of that. But part of it, I think, has to do with humanity's living experience with these substances and all the experiences they've had with them. LSD strikes me as kind of cleaner in that respect. It doesn't have that same kind of programmed quality. Now, I don't know what it would have been like if I had been working with low doses of LSD. If I'd been working with low doses, I'm sure it would have activated. My experiences would have been much more personal and psychodynamically oriented. But working with the very high doses that I worked with, after the first 15 sessions or so, when the sessions were at their peak hours, I was not working in relationship to my personal psyche at all. In fact, pretty much in the book, I drop out the personal story as much as possible because the personal story kind of showed up at the beginning of a session and at the end of a session. And these were very meaningful experiences to me. They were very healing. They were very, helpful in giving me insights to relevant things in my life. But during the peak hours, I was usually operating far beyond the range of personal psyche. When I'm working with psilocybin, I don't have that experience of being so far removed from my personal reality. I only have limited experience with ayahuasca. I like the medicine very much. It's a very powerful medicine. It's been giving me some extraordinary help and extraordinary clarity here and there. But I don't have enough experience with it comparable to my 70-some high-dose LSD sessions to do a careful A/B. Right. But my basic sense is that the psilocybin tends to be less evocative, less disruptive, less opening up to the deep, deep levels. Ayahuasca is more disruptive, opening up to deeper levels still. And at least for me, LSD, working with it as I did, opens up to very, very deep cosmological levels eventually. I don't know of people, I have not seen, though I haven't tried to do an exhaustive search in the literature, but I have not seen people having experiences with psilocybin, and for the most part, even ayahuasca, that correlate to the experiences I was having in the last 10 years of my work with LSD. But again, that's just my personal experience. It's it's not a scholarly comparison.
Right. Yeah. And what were some of your experiences like towards the last 10 years? Like, I guess, Yeah, could you give us some examples of like those big themes that you were working through, if it wasn't so personal or psychodynamic?
Well, that's a hard question because there's so many levels, and there's so many. It's always tricky to kind of jump into the later stages because every stage builds upon earlier stages. But
right,
one of the barometers I would mention, for example, would be time. When I went into subtle level reality, for a year, I had a consistent set of experiences where I experienced the totality of my life from beginning to end as simultaneously present in the immediate now. So I not only had insights into my old age, and I didn't experience my age in a sort of abstract, theoretical way. I experienced the distilled essence of my entire life boiled down to right now. And all of the data of my life was present at this particular moment in time. This was such a mind-shattering possibility that when I first came back out of this experience, I couldn't remember it. It took me entering into it multiple times to be able to really be able to hold on to all of those experiences, which I write about in the chapter called Deep Time in the Soul. Going beyond that, I began to enter into archetypal dimensions of archetypal reality. I began to have experiences of something like the Platonic domain of the reality behind time-space reality, except it wasn't archetypes like Plato conceives of them. Plato conceives of archetypes as unchanging ideas in the mind of a transcendent intelligence. In my experience, these were vast, huge beings that were so huge I couldn't wrap my mind around them. And the best my mind could do in imaging them was to sort of see them as galaxies, which I think was simply my mind's attempt to image something that one would measure in hundreds or thousands of light years of scope. But these were beings that were responsible for creating time and space and orchestrating the unfolding of reality in time and space. I went into what I call deep time, which is not eternity. It isn't timelessness, but it's different magnitudes of time experienced within a simultaneous or broader frame of reference. So I had many experiences and became one of the overarching themes of my book, of my sessions, and therefore the book, of humanity's future, where humanity was going, what our moment in history was, what the archetypal trajectory of humanity was, what was happening behind the scenes in this global sustainability crisis that we're entering into. What I have a chapter in the book called The Birth of the Future Human. Lots and lots of going into deep time, going deep into humanity's future, experiencing what is attempting to be born in this period of history, how evolution works on this larger, broader scale. And then eventually going deep into various episodes of causal oneness, shunyata, emptiness, the experience of primal void, the void that's behind physical manifest existence, experience of cosmic love, just being overwhelmed with, and I think love is basically a kind of characteristic of the inherent oneness of life. When you experience the deep, deep oneness that existence is, then, the emotional counterpart of that is love, it's compassion, the emotion of oneness. And then eventually going beyond oneness, beyond the void, into this diamond luminosity state, which once I touched the diamond luminosity, this occupied the last 5 years of my work. Once I touched it, it was a state of state of being, state of consciousness, so incredibly clear, so exquisitely clear, that once I touched it, I wasn't interested in exploring any of the other dimensions of consciousness that I had been exploring for years. Returning to that condition became my sole objective. And in the 26 sessions, covering 4 years of work, I only touched that condition 4 times. And in between those 4 sessions were tremendous cleaning, tremendous purification, tremendous detoxification, so that I could return to that condition and experience it more clearly, more completely. So there's a lot of levels, and that's what makes the story a complex story to tell.
Yeah. Well, and people should check out the book and read through all this. So definitely.
Well, it's nice now that the book is out, they don't have to get it from me speaking, I've done my best to tell the story as cleanly and simply as I can without a lot of the philosophical baggage that may have been in some of my earlier works.
Right.
Is there a story that you'd like to tell the most about your project that maybe you could share here? Or any kind of specific gem you like to share the most?
It's a story of a journey. And every phase of the journey was an exciting adventure in its own right at the time when I was entering into that territory. And each one was absolutely fascinating and captivating to me when I was going through this material. And so I don't have a favorite per se. I mean, I think, of course, the Diamond Luminosity is, for my own personal heart, that is the deepest dimensions of the story, the deepest aspect. I think the story of the birth of the future human, where reincarnation is taking humanity, is an important component of the story, because what happened to me in one particular session, in the 38th session, without just cutting down to the important piece here, is that I began to experience all my lives coming into me. All my former lives were kind of being integrated. And I've done a lot of other work, hypnotic regression work, to familiarize myself with some of my deep life history. But I experienced all my former lives coming in very quickly. It was like wrapping string around a kite spool. And there came a moment when all of that energy, with all those living experiences, they fused. And when they fused, they ignited, and there was a tremendous explosion of diamond light from my chest. And it threw me into a completely different state of consciousness. And I think what I was being shown in this experience, what I was being given, was an understanding of where reincarnation is taking us. Because classically, reincarnation, leads to a gradual, hopefully a sustained development of more compassion, more understanding, developing our qualities of our deep essential nature at more and more richer and richer levels. We make mistakes, we go back, we learn, we go forward in this process. But I don't think the process is really about taking us incrementally to eventually producing a better life, which is incrementally +1 from where we were previously. I think eventually if we die and we expand in the after-death condition, we're born and we contract into an immediate one life focus. We die and we expand and we're born. We go back and forth. And if we keep this up just for hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, if we keep this up, sooner or later, the totality of our consciousness, which most people would experience only after they die, the deep soul, sooner or later, that soul consciousness, I think, the evolutionary trajectory is for this consciousness to wake up inside our physical incarnation. And that's what I call the birth of the diamond soul. When we wake up and we are not tempted to identify with simply egoic, this body, mind kind of structure, that we know ourselves to be an internal being, we know ourselves to be in relationship with other eternal beings. We have a felt sense of history with many, many of these beings, and the compassion that comes with that history, and a sense of open transparency to the cosmic intelligence at large. I think that's basically where we're going. And I don't know, I think this is not a private experience, it's a collective experience. The universe doesn't work in small numbers. The universe works with whole species. And what's happening is really an evolving of our entire species in the direction. If there were one thing, I guess I would come back to, one thing which I wish I could kind of reach into my heart and communicate to people, it would be to let go of this terribly constricting fear of death. Because if we're afraid of dying, we've got it all backwards. Here's where the hard work is done. When we die, we have all this Hollywood bullshit about what happens to us when we die, and most of it is just trash.
Right.
When we die, we enter, we go back home. We enter, the vast majority of us enter very easily straight into the depth of where we come from. And there are many layers of that reality, so there's a lot of work to do. But there's absolutely nothing to fear in death. And one of the things that's come out of my work is I don't have a fear of death. I mean, dying is pain in the ass, but being dead has absolutely no fear for me. In fact, it's something I look forward to very much.
Kyle, how do you respond to that?
That resonates a lot with me of what you're saying, like kind of gave me a little bit of chills. So I don't know if you know my story. Listeners probably know this if you've been following us for a while. But when I was 16, I had a near-death experience. And so ruptured my spleen. When I was in the MRI or the CAT scan machine, I was overwhelmed with this blissful feeling of love and beauty that I was going back home. And there was a sense, something came over me and said, "You're going back home. You're going back to the stars where we all come from, and this, physical life's going to cease to exist, but you're going to continue on." And that was really beautiful. And it wasn't scary. When I first heard I was dying, like they said, you have internal injuries, you're losing massive blood. I thought, I was pretty terrified. But in that moment, as I was drifting away, total acceptance. And so I actually had a really hard time coming back here, right? Because it was, and I could probably resonate with that idea, the Diamond Luminosity, of wanting to return there, because I definitely resonate with that feeling of wanting to return to that oneness that I felt on that night. And that's what got me into exploring psychedelics, is having very similar experiences with psychedelics and correlating that to my near-death experience, and wanting to get back there. And over time, and maybe you'll resonate with this, is like the period in between of stopping and actually focusing on the integration. And I keep coming back to this idea that the work is here. This is where all the magic happens. And how do we really embody that and show up?
Yeah. To complain about the restrictions of time and space is kind of like a weightlifter complaining about the weights. And this is where the work is done. Time space is an extremely demanding environment, but progress made here has exponential import for what's available to us when we die. Of all the various populations, the people I feel the closest affinity from my own psychedelic work are the near-death episode people. I taught near-death episode research for years at my university in one of my courses, and so I've really read deeply in the near-death literature. And that's the closest correlation I find with the deepest of the psychedelic experiences. Very strong correlations. And Ken Ring, who's one of the near-death episode, one of the founders of that movement, and we've written together and dialogued together. He's a good friend around that.
Yeah, it's a powerful topic. Something I think about often, right? And I guess my early experiences got me really on this path was just that, I entered into this space where it just felt so similar with this. I had an experience with psilocybin where it was just so on par with dying, and it just captivated my attention of how could a substance like this. I mean, I guess in a sense, if you take it from the psychotherapeutic lens, it's like reliving trauma, right? my psyche is processing that experience, and I'm going back there to kind of reprocess it. But I have plenty of other experiences where it still felt pretty similar and on par with that original near-death experience.
Yeah. I've died many times. I mean, I feel like, and that was the whole impetus in the early work at Spring Grove, was to give people a foretaste of where they're going when they die. And, I've gone through that. And shamans, this is very familiar territory. So there's nothing unique to me there. But I've gone through that death process so many times. It feels very comfortable and very natural. Mm-hmm. And coming back is sometimes challenging. I mean, the hardest chapter for me to write in this book was the last chapter, coming off the mountain. Because it basically tells a story of what happened after I stopped my sessions. And I basically entered into a period eventually of deep, deep existential loneliness. I found that I had really worked very hard in integrating my sessions. I did all by very carefully. I wrote them down. I studied them. I tried to incorporate their teaching into my life. I really thought I had it, locked down pretty well. And I thought, therefore, that I could stop my sessions and I would just be able to kind of collect and ponder the many gifts that I had been given through the years. But what I learned was that integrating an entire journey is different than integrating individual sessions. And that by repeatedly going deeper and deeper and deeper into the universe and experience the exquisite ecstasy of dissolving into sheer light repeatedly, and dissolving into the crystalline body of the divine, when, for various reasons, I made the decision that it was time for this work to stop, I found that I had I was suffering from a loss of communion, a deep, deep existential sadness. And eventually, years down the road, I found that I was really just waiting to die, so that I could return to the light. And I realized, that wasn't right. That's not the way this work is supposed to end. My entire body was screaming failure to integrate. Yeah. But because I had been so careful trying to integrate, it wasn't clear where the imbalance had come in. What I found eventually is that there was an imbalance that I had cultivated inadvertently between transcendence and immanence. It's all the divine. The physical universe is the divine. I knew that it was the divine. I knew that we're never absent from the divine for any moment. It's only our own illusions that keep us in that sense. But I had pushed so deeply into transcendence that to a certain degree, I had lost my footing in the immanent divine. And I had to make a conscious choice and undertake specific practices to really kind of ground myself back in the immanent divine for the remainder of my years on this earth. It took about 10 years for me to really get solidly, comfortably back inside my time-space suit.
Wow. I could imagine after 20 years of deep exploration, I mean, I'd say that's probably a pretty long integration process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, in this respect, my story is sometimes described as a hero's journey, but it's not the hero's journey the way it's usually thought of. It's not simply going and experiencing something and bringing back, something valuable for your culture, for yourself. It's tempered by, a kind of lesson that comes from dealing with not the failure of some aspect of the journey, but actually of the success of the journey, of being wounded by the sheer beauty of what one experiences. You literally are wounded by the beauty of the universe, by the experiencing the extraordinary intelligence of the universe, extraordinary love of the universe. And if you're not able to create a container inside your historical existence where you can breathe this intelligence in and breathe the compassion in, then, it's like it literally can kind of become painful. Mm-hmm. So my story is in part it's a cautionary tale. It cautions against, and even though I tried to be as methodical as possible and do it as carefully as possible and integrate it as deeply as I could, it cautions against going too deep, too fast, if you can call 20 years too fast. going too deep or deeper than you can actually productively use. And I think my memories have changed not only the rest of the years of my life, but my memories have changed the trajectory of my soul's entire evolution. Mm-hmm. So I don't think of the results of my journey as necessarily coming to fruition in just, the next few decades. I think they come to fruition over lifetimes. It's changed the entire trajectory of my deep evolutionary project. And I think that's true for anyone who enters into this. When you enter into deep intimacy with life in this way, you purify and you offload a lot of, painful trauma, whatever. But you also open up to a different relationship with the universe. Right now, my primary way of being with the universe in this intimate way is not working with psychedelics. That time of my life is largely over. I'm 70 years old, and this is, somewhat of a young person's game. Mm. I do a lot of classical contemplative practice. I do a lot of Vajrayana practice, which I find to be very complementary to deep psychedelic work. I don't feel any cross purposes between the two different methods of working. I should mention in this context, though, I think it would be a mistake to sort of evaluate the value of deep psychedelic work by holding it accountable just to the Enlightenment project. I started this work with an agenda of an Enlightenment project. What happened was my personal awakening was completely eclipsed eventually by a project of a collective awakening. All of my work began to be focused on a type of healing of the collective psyche that went beyond my personal healing, and an awakening of the collective psyche that went beyond my personal awakening. And then it became just a radical adventure, a cosmological adventure, going so deep that it would be impossible to bring those experiences back and stabilize them in some kind of spiritually awakened state. It's just a different project. The Enlightenment project and cosmological exploration project, these are two different projects that have to be evaluated on their own terms. My 2 cents.
No, yeah, I would agree. It sounds, yeah.
Yeah, so this is quite the interview. It's certainly like a much... I knew it was going to be a big topic, but I'm always impressed by how big some of these things become. And, I do think some people are doing similar projects nowadays, though.
Yeah.
I wonder if LSD is still in vogue in this context.
I don't know. I don't know. I worked with LSD primarily because that was the work that Stan had done most of his early work with, and I trusted what I saw in Stan's research, and I trusted, the history there and the methodology he developed. I only began to work with other psychedelic substances pretty much after my LSD work was done. And so the mind that I brought to my psilocybin experiences and my ayahuasca experiences and salvia divinorum, so on and so forth, the mind that had been transformed by all my previous psychedelic work, which is the other thing to, important to take account of, that the mind, the experiences that we have reflect the entire history of our working in non-ordinary states of consciousness. So if we've done this work only a few, 2 or 3 times, well, then we have that kind of depth of experience to bring to it. But if we've been doing this work for years and years and years, naturally these substances are going to have a different kind of effect, right, because we've been transformed. The way I think of this is that, at least in my experience, The universe is an infinite ocean of possibilities, just an infinite ocean of we'll never, ever get to the end of it. I used to think that we'll get to an end state. That was the project, to get to the hold, to get to the end condition. That was taken away from me along the journey. I began to understand it's an infinite progression. I'm getting distracted from my original point by that particular image. Yeah, I'll just stick with that. I lost my train of thought, but
that works for us because it's our orientation is this Groffian meets Whitehead and John Cobb kind of synthesis, and largely that's at least the project of the company here. But it's good to hear that, and it rhymes in a sense with that bodhisattva vow of let's keep going. Like there's not this end point of nirvana until everybody's there. And it's going to be a long, 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 long time, if time even enters into that discussion.
It's a long time, except of course it's speeding up. It's kind of like our collective karma as a species is coming at us hard. The whole history, our culture is basically a culture that's been built by ego. And for all the many virtues and values of the ego, it's basically, it's fundamentally a fragmented condition, and therefore it creates a world which is deeply imbalanced between ourselves and between other life forms. And, that world is coming to a radical and accelerated breakdown. And I think this is actually part of the evolutionary pivot, that we are coming into a time where we literally will not be able to continue operating out of the same, not just an economic or industrial or technological basis, but we will not be able to continue functioning out of the same psychological basis of egoic consciousness. So how fast we might make this transition, if we use historical projections from the past, we probably deeply underestimate how fast this could happen. In fact, in that chapter on the birth of the future human, where I talk about particularly one session 55, it took me deep into the death and rebirth of humanity. The message that kept coming through over and over and over again was, this is going to happen much faster than anyone is imagining. It's going to happen much faster. So I think the game is getting very, very intense. We're being driven into nonlinear dynamics.
Feels that way.
Nonlinear consciousness, the dynamics, the collective psyche is being hyperstimulated by the trauma that we're going into. And when systems, we know from physical systems, when physical systems enter into nonlinear conditions, they can do things that they could not do when they were in lower energy linear conditions. And I think that something similar happens with psychic fields. And when the integrated psychic field that holds all of our individual minds, when that psychic field is hyperstimulated by the suffering that we're going into, but it's hyperstimulated, will eventually move into a nonlinear condition, and the rules of nonlinear conditions of dynamics apply to psychic fields as well as physical fields. Small changes can elicit huge outcomes. Latent connectivity, which was kind of invisible at the linear level, becomes suddenly active and visible at the nonlinear level. Things can happen much faster at the nonlinear level than at the linear level. So, we're going into a trial by fire. And I think this trial is actually part of the conscious intention of the creative intelligence itself. I don't think it's accidental. And I don't think there are any victims here. Personally, my own personal belief is we all chose to be here. We chose to be part of this time in history.
Yeah,
it's an extraordinarily important time to be fully conscious and fully active.
It's giving me chills thinking about that. Yeah, it's interesting. It does feel like things are really kind of speeding up. And sometimes I'm like, oh, you always kind of hear that as you get older, time seems to be speeding up. But even talk to people that are older and like things just seem to be happening quicker and quicker. It is really interesting. I feel like I can't hold on to anything. It's like once you kind of grasp onto it, something else has already changed form.
Yeah. so many of not only our technology is driving us this way, but our social customs, are just, they're dissolving right out from underneath us. The standards of truth are changing. And it's a confusing time, and it's a dangerous time, and it's a hard time. But it's an extraordinarily exciting time.
It is. Do you see psychedelics aiding in this in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the ways in which psychedelics have come back into our culture, both from the Central American and South American cultures, which have kept this tradition alive, the new psychedelics, these, LSD is often compared to the atom bomb, since they were discovered at the same time. This this opportunity to explore dimensions of consciousness that previous generations, for the most part, classically have had to spend lifetimes meditating in order just to get access to some of them. And now people of even modest spiritual capacities can have temporary experiences of these realities, which have a profound, they require a profound redrafting of our existential assumptions about how life works, and that we can do this. We can engage these dimensions of consciousness, not for recreational purposes and not even for healing purposes, but we can engage them systematically for educational and deep transformational purposes, not only for our own personal transformation, but we can work on behalf of the collective in these states of consciousness. I mean, I think psychedelics that's what I saw when I first read Stan Grof's book. I thought, wow, this is going to change everything. It's going to be a true before and after development. It's like the invention of as he said, the microscope for biology and the telescope for astronomy. Mm-hmm. It just increases the quantity of data we have access to, so that it forces a radical revision of our theoretical understanding. I think psychedelics are part of it. Mm-hmm. And just in time, because we have very little time.
Yeah. It feels that way.
Yeah, it's coming at us very fast. Very fast.
Cool. So I hate to end the podcast, but we're at over an hour, and I want to be respectful of your time, and I really appreciate this. This is a very enlightening episode. Can you tell us a little bit about where people can find your book and perhaps the upcoming audiobook?
They can find the book on Amazon. I'm just putting the final edits on the audiobook. I'm not sure that will be released through Inner Traditions. I'm not quite sure what the vehicle will be for that, but it should be out hopefully by the beginning of the year. I will have a website up hopefully by the first of the year. I'm way overdue in revising this website and getting it posted, but eventually within a month or so, people will be able to find me at chrisbache.com. That's going to be the easiest way. Right now, most of my written work and some tapes are collected at academia.edu under my name. Cool. You can find them listed there. But right now, I'm not as good on social media as I should be.
It's hard to keep up with.
Yeah.
Only do one. It's not worth being everywhere.
Yeah. But what's really exciting is the book is finally out, and it's as clear a presentation of this material as I've been able to. It took me 5 years to put it together and bring it forward, and it's as good as I can tell the story.
Well, thank you for all your work, and really appreciate you joining us on the show today.
Thank you, guys. It's been a real honor. I really appreciate the work you're doing. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Keep getting the word out. You guys are social catalysts. We need all the social catalysts we can get these days.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll keep plugging along.
Thank you for tuning in to Psychedelics today. This interview with Dr. Chris Bache was super interesting for me, and I really can't wait to dig into his work more. It sounds super fascinating, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, or didn't, let us know. psychedelicstoday@gmail.com. We'd really like to hear feedback. If you want to support the show, we accept small monthly donations over at patreon.com/psychedelicstoday. If you want to do it at no charge, you can just tell a friend, and also leave us a review on Facebook or iTunes or your podcast app. Any of those places help a ton. So please, just take a quick minute to help us out. It would be much appreciated. We also have a course called Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists coming up. Class starts February 6th, and we are very excited about it. It's an 8-week course, goes through the end of March, and it is extraordinary. Tons of pre-recorded content, class time with Kyle and I to discuss ideas. We'll also have guest teachers. There's master classes and much more. We facilitate the class on Zoom as a kind of web platform. So it's video. You get to see our faces. We can see your faces if you want to let us see your faces. And we get to chat and work through a lot of this material together. So hope you are interested. If you are, check it out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com or psychedelicstoday.com to find the link for this course for clinicians and therapists. And I think that's it for now. Thank you all for tuning in to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe signing off from Breckenridge, Colorado. See you on the next episode. Bye-bye.